Morning. I'm Eric Jacobson, the founder of Manufacturer Insights. I work as a business growth consultant at iConnection. iConnection is a digital marketing agency that specializes in website design and website marketing. I'm excited today to have Brian Blatchley back. This is the second part of our EOS series. Good morning, Brian.
Good morning, Eric. Thanks for having me.
Brian Blatchley is a certified EOS implementer. And last time he covered for us an overview of the EOS model. Today we're going to deep dive into a couple of the other components from EOS that we didn't cover last time. Brian, I think it may be helpful if you step back and just do a short recap for us for people who may not have seen part one.
Got it. Thank you, Eric. The EOS model, EOS stands for the Entrepreneurial Operating System, and it is 6 components of any business that we believe in EOS, that if you focus on those 6 components, and I'm going to run through those 6 at a very high level in a second, that if you focus on those 6 components, that everything in your business will fall into one of these components, or they will fall away simply because they're a symptom of something that hasn't been addressed. So at a very high level, I'm going to walk you around the model. The first is the vision component, and merely that is getting your entire leadership team on the same page. In the first entry into our series here, I did a deep dive into the vision, so feel free to go back and go through the 8 questions that are indicated there and why the vision is so important. You need to know where you're taking your company and how you're going to get there. You need to be on the same page as a leadership team, and your entire company needs to understand that so they can drive your business in the direction you want it. The second component is the people component. And in EOS, we believe that 80% of your challenges in your business will be in this component. Again, this was a component that we took a deep dive in. Please refer back to the first edition. But 80% of the problems are here. Getting the right people, excuse me, has to do with making sure they align with your values. And sitting in the right seat has to do with them occupying a role in your organization that they are able to effectively deliver results that you expect. So they're the 2 that we've already talked about. The next component at a high level is the data component. And the data component has to do with focusing on information that everybody on the team can see and understand. Very often in entrepreneurial businesses, we find that the owner, founder, visionary person often is making decisions based on gut instinct, how we've done it in the past. We try to move our teams over to here's data that's telling you whether you're being successful or not, so you can address it before your company heads in the wrong direction. Once you have a clear vision, you have great people sitting in right seats, and you're making data-driven decisions, a lot of transparency comes to your company. A lot of the things that may have been hidden because they were in the smoke and mirrors of the lack of transparency become much more transparent, okay? Our next component is the issues component. This is about being able to identify the issues in your company that are there, serving them up on a regular basis and solving them for the long term, solving them in the right team and right department that makes sense so that you are constantly moving the company forward. The process component has to do with documenting the predictable and repeatable processes in your business. Predictable and repeatable being key. Very often processes, if you have them, are in somebody's head. When somebody leaves, when somebody's hired, there's no training material. If you're able to document the predictable and repeatable things in your business, you're able to train people, you're able to measure people, you're better able to hold people accountable to do those things the best and right way each and every time, which only improves the operation. And finally, the traction component has to do with bringing the vision down to the ground with discipline and accountability throughout the organization. So that's the 6 key components. As I mentioned in our first entry into this series, we did a deep dive into vision. We did a deep dive into the people component. And today I'm going to do a deep dive into the data, issues, process, and traction component to round out our series.
What do you find out in the field for businesses that maybe have gone through the process? How do you keep them mindful of the components as time goes by? So, in other
Um,
words, are there like refresher courses or things like that?
Absolutely. Our normal engagement with the team that we work with is 8 fiscal quarters. And in that 8 fiscal quarters, we meet every 90 days. We live in a 90-day world in EOS. We lay foundation, we do foundational work 3 days. And then after that, it's simply every 90 days. And what we're doing is building up a habit. We're building up a habit where every team has to stop every 90 days because we live in a 90-day world in EOS. So every 90 days we stop, we get out of the day-to-day business, and I encourage people to think from 30,000 feet. Look down on the business, and there's a couple key components here. One, we look back at the last quarter and say, hey, what went well? What went wrong? And what do we learn from that? The learning piece is really one of the major components here. We then focus on the vision as a team. Are we aligned? Are we still heading in the right direction? And then what are our priorities for the next 90 days? And then we go back to work for the next 89 days. And in 90 days, we come back and do it all over again. My goal as an implementer is to get teams into that rotation over 8 fiscal quarters so that they have the ability to do this all on their own. My job is not to embed myself with the company forever. My job is to get a team up to speed and do that repetition. Now my goal is to graduate teams. And graduation means I've taught you all of the tools, you understand them, excuse me, they're in use, and you are then going to start doing your quarterly meetings by yourself. Some teams are really good at doing them by themselves and they go off very happily and occasionally we'll check in if they have a question. I have one team that I do simply their annual quarterly, which is their update for their 3-year picture, their annual goals, their rocks. It's a check-in once a year that I do with them to make sure they're not drifting away from EOS. So that's one method. The other is about 40% of our clients decide that the value of having somebody from the outside work with them is just too valuable to stop doing. They're able to graduate. They just like having a facilitator in the room. I probably have 4 or 5 clients at the moment that have indicated to me that they have no interest in graduating. I'm in 3rd year, heading into 4th year with a couple of those.
Let's start with data. I know working for a web marketing company, data is very important. There's a saying, what's measured gets done. I think that may be a good one to dig in on the EOS model. Let's have you go ahead
Excellent.
with that.
Okay. In any company, if you think back 30 years ago, there wasn't enough data that people had easily accessed in order to run their businesses. Today, there is just so much data, it's incredible. It's really about identifying the data that makes the most sense for your team. Now, there's a lot of data that is important to you. For example, your financial results, that's data, but that's a lagging indicator. So at the end of the month, you're going to sit down with your leadership team and look at that and do your takeaways and comparisons, important, but not what we focus on in EOS. In EOS, our data component has to do with building out a set of 5 to 15 key metrics for every team in your company. So we start with the leadership team, and the purpose of this is these are weekly data points that tell you whether or not you're having a good week or a bad week. Think of it as the windshield for your company. If you're driving, you're looking through the windshield, you're looking forward. You're trying to stay on the road, you're trying to not hit other people, you're trying to get to your destination without any issue. That's what we're doing, 5 to 15 numbers that are going to tell us this week, are we on track? Yes or no. If we're not on track, we make it an issue. If we are on track, we just note it as a team. This is reviewed during the L10 meeting, and I'll talk about that when we get to the traction component a little bit later. We have a scorecard model that we use. You can download it from the website for free. And it really has to do with these 5 to 15 numbers, and it looks like this. You define what those metrics are, those leading indicators. Again, very specific to the team, because the leadership team's going to have a set of numbers, the finance team's going to have a set of numbers, the operations team, etc. So what's relevant to the leadership team? What are those metrics? We're going to predefine as a team what the goal is for that metric. For example, if revenue is $100,000 a week, we know that in advance. So the goal is $100,000. Week one comes along, we're $101,000. We're on track. We move on. Everybody's on the same page. We've closed the circle of knowledge. Okay. Everybody sees it. If it's 95,000, we know that it's off track and it becomes an issue, but we don't have to talk about it because we've already preset the goal. We know whether it's on track or not. The second component here is we have the metric, we have the goal, and we have singular accountability based on the accountability chart that we discussed last time. Who owns driving revenue? We know whose eyeballs to look at when revenue's on track to say thank you, great job. And when it's off track, how can we help? What's going on? Let's have a discussion. So singular accountability for the person for each metric, the metric and the goal. And then we track a 13-week period every quarter. So week one, new data comes up. Week 13 is the full trend. 14, it drops off at the end every week. Okay, so it's a moving, rolling data information, 5 to 15 numbers. The whole purpose here again is to tell you whether you're on track or off track. Now, you may not have a priority of spending time in your leadership team meeting figuring out why it's off track when it's only a single week. The ability to have that trend is also very important. Second, third, fourth week of missing revenue becomes a much higher priority. The second part of the data component has to do with everybody in your company having a number. We call it a measurable. So somewhere within the company, in the various scorecards that we ultimately develop in EOS, everybody's name exists in one spot. This is really important. And again, this goes to culture building. 50% of the people in the United States, when Gallup does a survey, have no idea how they individually contribute to the success of your company. Okay. We talked about this last time. You're building a culture in your vision with your core values, and you have a long-term vision. Where's the company going? That becomes the story and the enticement for people to come work for you. The rest of that engagement comes from, I have a number that I'm responsible. Could be one number, could be 2 or 3 numbers that I know for sure that connects me to the company and its success. So having a scorecard in place in all the departments and teams and having numbers that are assigned to each and every person to be a contributor is the data component in a total. So that's data. That's really the entire thing that we look at. Again, we start with the leadership team, and then we build these scorecards out throughout the organization.
Brian, how do you keep the data kind of collection and reporting process manageable?
First, we start with only 5 to 15 numbers, so we don't believe that's overwhelming. The biggest challenge when I teach scorecards, and every new team, day one, I tell them we're going to take a first pass at your scorecard, and you're going to hate it. Because this is a bigger challenge than most people understand. It takes 60, 90, 120 days, and I'm very open and honest about that, for you to get to the point where you've got the numbers that are really telling you whether you're having a good week or not. And there's a lot of opportunity to teach people and how to find those numbers a little more easily when we work with them. But finding those 5 to 15 numbers that really tell you whether you're having that good week or not is not overwhelming. It's about how you find what numbers are important and how you're going to get the data easily. Because sometimes we have to break down the components of how you generate those numbers. We call the getting what you want tool. So here is what you need to find, and here is the beginning of the process that has milestones that get you there. Sometimes you can't measure this, but you can go upstream to one of the milestones that you can easily measure. So you know that if you measure that milestone, you get the proper outcome. So there's some nuances involved, but we don't believe that it should be very time consuming for you to do the reporting on your numbers if you do this correctly. And I constantly come back to that because what I find sometimes is teams are doing it and they're doing it rote and they're not saying we're off track and actually putting it on their issues list. They just let it ride. And that's the biggest challenge I have. If something is off track, it automatically becomes an issue in EOS world, whether it's a big enough priority to discuss or not.
Issues is the next component of EOS that you're going to cover, right?
Yes, sir. We talked about the fact that if you have a clear vision, you have right people sitting in right seats, and you are making data-driven decisions, your company just becomes much more transparent. And that transparency is exposing the issues, the warts, the problems that may have been muddled and not clearly transparent as they are now. We have a component called the issues component, and don't get caught up in the term issue. Not every issue is a dumpster fire. An issue is simply the terminology we use to indicate I've got a subject that we need to talk about. Could be a dumpster fire, could be a great idea, could be an update that I need to give the rest of the team. We have two components, we have two items, disciplines within our issues component. One is building out an issues list within every team. There needs to be a place where everybody in the company can raise their hand, put an issue on the list for their regularly scheduled team meetings. So it's an opportunity, hey, I've got an idea, I've got a problem, or we've got a dumpster fire heading our way. Everybody in the company gets to contribute. The second component has to do with the issue solving track. How do we systematically address each and every one of those issues? We teach a methodology called IDS, and I'll jump into that in a minute. So an issues list is simply an issues list. We talked about when we reviewed the scorecard, which we will do at our regular team meetings. If something is off track, we've set a goal. We didn't meet the goal. We all acknowledge it's off track. It just simply goes on the issues list to discuss. Having that list is important. The second and most important part of this is the issue solving track, or IDS. IDS stands for identify, discuss, and solve. And I'm sure we've all been in that meeting where we sit down and somebody puts a topic on the table and you spend the next hour talking about it 6 ways from Sunday, never really clarifying what you're trying to solve and never really coming out with a game plan. And the meeting ends and 3 weeks later, you're having the same conversation. Great teams can do that. It really is the simple fact that they're not using a system to clarify what they're trying to solve. IDS is really that symptom. When we are in our weekly team meetings, we look at the issues list and we prioritize. We always say, what's the 1, 2, and 3 most important things that we should be looking at to start with as a team to solve? Because just because something's at the top of our list doesn't mean it's the most priority. 1, 2, 3. When we get the first issue, the facilitator picks the issue, identifies it, and we then spend 70% of our time. When we're focused on solving an issue, the biggest part of the problem is clearly identifying, hence identifying what the core problem is. Because 3 words on an issues list does not really help you. When somebody puts world hunger on an issues list, what are you trying to solve? Because obviously you can't solve world hunger. You have to peel back the onion. You have to ask the why questions. Why is something a certain way? You spend 70% of your time digging into that issue so you know what's clear. The second component is the solve component, which means everybody on the team has the opportunity to contribute. Here's what I think, here's my perspective, and we go around the room and that conversation continues until we start becoming repetitive. We call repeating yourself politicking, and we stop at that point. 80% of the time, the facilitator is going to be able to get a sense of the room and say, it sounds like here's our solve and our next steps. The other 20% of the time, when the team isn't completely aligned, we have an integrator. And the integrator, many people understand, we talked about that last time, is the person responsible for the business plan and the profitability of the business. That's a singularly owned accountability for the integrator. When you have a tie, when you have a not a clear consensus, they make the decision because they own the profitability and executing the business plan. Identify, discuss, solve. When you solve it, there's action items. We call them to-dos. People get assigned action items, and they're due in the next 7 days. It's a phone call, it's a conversation, it's an email. Whatever the action item is that makes sense from that issue. We scratch off one, we go to two, identify, discuss, and solve, and so forth. We do that at the leadership team level, and we'll talk about that as the component of what we call the L10 meeting when we get to the traction component. But solving problems, moving your company forward. We don't duct tape things. We don't work around things. We address the elephant in the room. We solve the hard problems and we move forward. And that's really the issues component.
So on the issues list, there are 10 lines. Is there a case where you've added too many issues? Is 10 the max? Is there a minimum that leads to effectiveness, or is it just organic?
It's organic, and I find, and I look for and hope for, as I work with teams, the issue list continues to build and build to the point where the team starts to worry that they're not efficient. Okay, so when we come back together, the idea of being able to get these issues out of their head and onto a piece of paper, that's half the battle. If I have teams that aren't able to list their issues, to me, that's an issue, right? People get used to solving problems the old way instead of putting them in front of the team, maximizing the problem-solving power of a team and truly moving the company forward. There is no max. I've seen issues lists with 60 things on it. And at quarterly meetings, we always have about 2 hours on our agenda to try to clean up that list. We spend concerted time once every 90 days really focusing on identifying and cleaning up that list, solving as many of those problems as we can.
And prioritizing. If you have
Yes,
10 items on a list, they're not all number one, right?
absolutely. We teach being good predictors in EOS is a key management skill that you have to learn. Predicting and prioritizing, I almost use interchangeably.
Okay, so you've covered the issues component. Let's go ahead and dig into process.
All righty, the process component. I don't know whether you can see my band here that says lack of process equals lack of results. I believe and live that. Lack of process leads to lack of results. And I use this example all the time because I'm always carrying my Yeti. Okay, I got a big Yeti full of coffee. You can't tell I'm caffeinated, I know. But Yeti, go figure, makes Yeti for a living. And they ship Yetis for a living. It is a predictable and repeatable process. Now, when I sit in a room and I explain this to the 5 or 6 members of a leadership team, I say to them, if I hand you, you're all in the shipping department, and I hand you my Yeti and say, ship it, and there's not a process, one of you is going to FedEx it, one of you is going to put it in the mail, one of it's going to UPS it, and you're going to have no consistency. The idea with predictable and repeatable processes is that you as a leadership team are going to determine first, what are the steps, because that tells you what is the best and right way to do it each and every time. So there is no, I have to sit and figure it out, talk every time. That's solving the same problem over and over again, if you will. Predictable and repeatable processes, every company has, we believe, 5 to 10, 12 at most. Things like the people component, or HR you can call it. There's a sales process. There is a marketing process, 1 or 2 or 3 operations processes possibly, a finance process, customer service process, whatever it is, we work with teams to determine what those repeatable and predictable processes are. And then we teach them how to actually write out what those processes look like. The purpose of documenting and simplifying those, which is the tool we talk about, documenting and simplifying those processes is so that once they're clear and everybody agrees this is the right way to do it, we can then train the people who touch the process. Here's how we want you to do it. We can measure it on a team scorecard. for frequency, compliance, and outcomes. Here's a process you touch. Are you doing it right? LMA is the next step. If you are missing the measurable, that is the process, your supervisor, and if you remember when we talked about accountability chart, LMA is leadership management equals accountability. That your supervisor is going to hold you accountable to those numbers if you're missing them and getting you back on track. And then once a year, at minimum, we update every one of those processes. So it's document, train, measure, holding accountable through LMA, and update. It's a closed circle. If you solve an issue and find out your process is incorrect, you're going to update the process, check the document. You're going to train people on the new process. You're going to continue to measure it properly, and LMA. What you get out of this, and in most entrepreneurial companies, we're going from zero process, or it's simply in somebody's head, to we do it at a high level, 20% of the steps that get you 80% there. Very entrepreneurial. 20% of the steps that we document get you 80% done. Then you say to me, how do we finish? What about all the if-and statements that belong in everybody's SOP manual? If you go back to our hiring, we talk about does somebody get one and have the capacity to do the job? So we believe if you hire the right people and they understand how their job interacts with everybody else, they're able to understand that, oh, FedEx has a shutdown in Atlanta and we can't FedEx something today. I'm smart enough to be able to go to UPS for the day. I shouldn't have to write that out. I shouldn't have to worry about every contingency because I've got the right people working for us. Outlining those predictable and repeatable things really gains traction for your company because you're executing things the best and right way each and every time.
I like how you brought in that right person. So now you can start to see how the different components of EOS work together, support each other. I always love talking about a multiplier effect.
Absolutely. It's all interconnected because we brought it to the scorecard, we brought it to the accountability chart, and it's all driven by process.
Great, Brian, we're heading into the home stretch here. We have the last component, which is traction. So let's go ahead and take us home here.
Excellent. There's two tools or discipline in this category, just like every other component. The first is rocks. And we talked about rocks when we talked about the 8 questions and living in a 90-day world. Rocks are simply 90-day business priorities that are defined first by the leadership team. We call those company rocks. They are the 3 to 7 top priorities that the leadership team has defined as the most important to get done in the next 90 days. Again, we live in a 90-day world. So rocks are 90-day business priorities that get reset. Company rocks are set by the leadership team, and they set the tone for the rest of the company because if you recall, we share company rocks once a quarter at what we call the State of the Company meeting, where we review the vision, traction, organizer. Then there are individual rocks. So company rocks are the top priorities. Others on the leadership team are able to take 3 to 7 individual rocks that they're willing to commit to the rest of the team, that they're going to take this bite-sized piece of this project and they're going to deliver X. We believe that 80% of the rocks, we look for a completion rate of 80%. Nobody has to sandbag at all because we give you that room to stretch and you can miss that last 20%, and we don't hold anybody accountable. We want you to stretch a little bit. So leadership team sets their rocks, and then that cascades down ultimately as the entire company learns how to develop rocks and commit to rocks. I have companies as big as 175 people. Last quarter, the team with 175 people set 144 rocks throughout the company, meaning there was 144 clearly defined, clearly deliverable rocks, deliverables, priorities that people throughout the company were working on. They delivered 77% of those. So even if you just do quick math and it's 100 plus, that means they're on track to do 400 clearly defined and deliverable things this year. That's where really traction comes in with rocks. The second component is what we call a meeting pulse. And meeting pulse is really about the cadence of meetings. With leadership teams, they live in the 90-day world. So once every 90 days, they got to stop. They got to look up. Where are we? What did we do? What went well? What did we learn? Are we on track? And set the priorities for the next quarter. Okay. So that's one set of cadence every 90 days. Once a year within that quarterly cadence, we also update our annual goals, our 3-year picture, et cetera. But in between that 90-day period, we execute what's called an L10 meeting. L meaning leadership, 10 meetings. We rate the meeting 1 to 10. 10 is the best it can be, 1 is the worst it can be. We always want to have a great meeting, so we call it the L10 meeting. And this is the agenda, and it's a cadence that we teach first at the leadership team level. And in EOS world, we believe that you should have an L10 meeting for the leadership team that lasts 90 minutes. And I'm often getting dirty looks for that. We talk all the time. You don't spend concerted time as a team problem solving. And that's what the EOS L10 meeting is. It's a problem-solving meeting. If you recall, at some point I said EOS boils down to a system that is about identifying problems, solving problems, and preventing problems. So here's a big part of that. So an L10 meeting has 5 components. It's same time, same day every week, starts on time, ends on time, and has the same agenda. Okay, that doesn't matter whether or not it's leadership team meeting or a frontline operations crew on the back of a pickup truck. Okay, everybody sits in an L10 meeting. The only difference is that the cadence may differ and the length of the meeting will be different for the guys on the back of the pickup truck. It's not necessarily weekly and it's not necessarily 90 minutes. So let's stick with the leadership team meeting. And here's what the agenda looks like. And you'll see the agenda listed next to me. The first thing is what 5 minutes we call segue. And that's really getting into sharing personal and professional best. It's you as a team taking a few minutes to get out of your day-to-day rush and communicate a little bit more as people. What's the most important thing going on in your professional world? What's the most important thing going on in your personal world that you'd like to share with your team members? It helps build team health. It breaks down walls. It builds trust. The second component is we review the scorecard. The 5 to 15 numbers we simply read down. We literally read it out loud. Revenue, $100,000 on track. Sales leads, goal, whatever. We literally read them down. There is no discussion. It's simply reporting. Anything that's off track drops to the issues list. Excuse me. We do the same thing then for the rocks list. We read the rock out loud. We turn to the person whose rock it is and say, on track or off track. If I'm the person, I say it's on track, we simply move forward. If it's off track, then it automatically drops down to the issues list. So no discussion so far. It's all reporting, getting everybody on the same page. And it's important that you read those rocks out loud each and every week, because by week 3, if you're just saying my rocks are on track, the rest of my team has no idea what I'm working on, right? You have to remind people because it's not their top priority. The next piece is customer employee headlines. We've got scorecards, we've got rocks, they're consistent. But here's that catch-all, and it's a headline, a sentence, not a parable, okay? It's, we signed a deal with Acme Company and we're moving forward. You want to learn more? Put it on the issues list. Everybody gets a chance to report a headline. Now everybody has the same information, and we've spent 20 minutes just getting everybody, we're closing the circle on that information. Last piece is, before we spend time issue solving, is the to-do review. Last week when we solved problems, we had to-dos. Remember, we talked about the email, the phone call, the conversation. To-dos are simply 7-day accountability items. It's a follow-up, so that if I was given a to-do to call a customer, a month later, I'm not going, oh my God, I never called that customer. I'm being held accountable at a 7-day window to get that done. If it's not done within 7 days, and we expect 90% of them to be done each and every week, but you get an extra 7 days, that happens. If it goes to 15 days, comes off your to-do list, becomes an issue list. It goes back on the issues list for one of 2 reasons. Either it's a bigger issue than you thought, and that's why it's not being completed, or somebody's not accountable to the rest of the team. And we need to talk about that. Then we move into the major part of this meeting. 60 minutes of 90 minutes, we IDS. We are solving problems and moving the company forward. The smartest, the highest paid people on your leadership team are in the room focused on solving problems so they can move the company forward. This is really a time management tool because it's getting the team together, getting everybody on the same page, and focused on identifying problems, solving problems, and preventing problems. And if you're doing those three things consistently, you're ultimately saving time. You're saving that fire that's going to break out later in the week because you weren't aware of it. It saves those little side meetings that often happen because you're focused and you're spending that time. 5 minutes before your 90 minutes are up, because end in time is an axiom of how we run an L10 meeting. We don't want meetings cascading. If that happens, people don't want to come to them because they've got the rest of their day. We end on time, period. 5 minutes before the meeting's over, if you're in mid-sentence on an issue, who's ever facilitating says we're out of time, just goes back on the issues list for next week, and we recap the to-dos. Just to make sure everybody's clear, we read the list of any to-dos that we solve for. We decide as a team, especially at the leadership team, are there any cascading messages? Do we as a team who speak with one voice need to say anything to the company about anything we talked about today? If so, what's the message and who's going to communicate it? And then finally, we rate the meeting, 1 to 10. 10 means that we worked well together as a team, we moved the ball down the field, and we stayed focused. You start with the 10, and if any of that didn't happen, you take points off. 8, 9, or 10 are tops. They're good. 10's being the best. If it's 7 or below, you have to tell the rest of your team why, because it's a self-correcting mechanism. Hey, guys, I'm giving it a 5 this week. We started talking about 2 issues on our scorecard. We went down 3 rabbit holes. We wasted 15 minutes. We didn't follow the agenda. We need to do that better next week. It's a self-correcting mechanism. It's the most effective time that you will spend with your leadership team in any week if you're doing this correctly. And that's really the traction component. Setting rocks and executing rocks, being effective at identifying problems and solving problems and moving the company forward. That's the traction in EOS.
I love that summary. And I wrote down when you said a sentence, not a parable. Having gone through the process, what recommendations or tricks do you have to help groups stay on track in meetings?
What I teach every single team is just because you have a facilitator doesn't let you as a participant of the meeting off the hook. Everybody that's in that meeting owns keeping the team on track. If the facilitator gets off track, anybody in the room can and should say, hey, we're off track, let's drop it down. That's the best medicine for a team that has trouble staying focused. It's not one person's job, it's everybody's job.
Great. Brian, thank you so much for running through both sessions, part 1 and today's part 2. And so if someone wants to engage your services or get some additional resources, how would they go about doing that?
You can go to my website, Brian Blatchley at EOS Worldwide. It'll be in the comments. You can also reach out. My phone number's in the comments. But the point I'd like to make is there's all kinds of resources. You don't have to use an implementer to work on EOS. Start with the books and understand what EOS is about. All the tools are available for free on the website. There are, through our corporate website, opportunities to do town halls where people interested in self-implementing EOS can go for free and hear other people and how they're implementing EOS in their companies. There's all kinds of tools. So ask for what you need. I'm glad to help point you in the right direction. It doesn't mean that you're hiring me as an implementer. I'm here to help you first get what you want for your business.
Thank you, Brian. And I do have to say, and I'm not saying this because you're here, I'm saying this because I've been through the process. Having an implementer can help an organization. You're engaging with the owners, presidents, CEOs of companies. as well as leadership. And having an implementer can help you get past some of that rank in a company to get better results. So that's my opinion. So it doesn't have to be yours, but I
I
think there's
appreciate it. It is very often easier for me as an outsider to be able to sometimes hold up a mirror to what's going on in a company and give them a clearer picture of what's holding them back and what they can do to move forward. So that's the advantage of being an outsider.
excellent. Thank you so much. You have a
Thank
great
you too.